The Discovery, Chapter 16, Part 3. A painful silence took over the air as Midnight thought over David's words.
What do you mean you can't?
Midnight asked softly. Tears welled in David's eyes as he leaned his head against the pod.
If you knew the truth, you'd hate me. Everyone would hate me.
David spoke. His tone was barely a whisper. Midnight slowly walked over to David. She quietly sat down next to him and looked up at him.
I do know the truth. I know the ship was hit by an asteroid. I know you lost power and had to get to the pod. And I know you tried to hold the door open for them.
Midnight said softly.
That's not it. That's not why they died. It was all my fault.
David painfully responded.
Then tell me how.
Midnight pleaded. Time seemed to drag on while Midnight waited for David to respond. Eventually, her gaze fell to the snow at her hooves, and her shoulders slumped. After several minutes of silence, her ears picked up on a very quiet sound, a drop of liquid impacting the snow right next to her. It took her only a moment to realize that it was a tear. She looked up to David's face, to see more tears streaming down his cheeks and falling to the snow. It was the first time she ever really seen David cry. Midnight's eyes fell down to his hands. They were shaking violently. Despite the cold, his hands were shaking far more than they should have been, especially since he had most likely arrived only minutes before her. She realized that it wasn't the cold that made him shiver this way, it was fear. Fear for what he was about to admit to her.
When we lost power, it was my job to reroute what we had left from the bridge to wherever the guys needed it.
David took several shaky breaths before he continued.
I messed up. I didn't see the fire in the oxygen cycle room. We would have been fine, but it blew up. Then I didn't save enough power for the airlock. It only had enough power for a minute, but I was scared. I didn't wait for them, I just ran inside. Then I couldn't. If I had just waited.
David trailed off, his sniffles and tears turning into sobbing. David fell to his knees, a pained grimace on his face as the tears clawed their way out of his eyes and spilled into the frozen ground below. Within a second, Midnight was on him, wrapping him in a hug and nuzzling her cheek against his. Her own tears threatened to fall at the sight of David in so much pain, but she held them back for his sake, opting instead to just hold him as close as she could.
It's my fault! I'm a fucking coward and I killed them!
David breathlessly shouted, pain evident in his tone.
You made a mistake. No one can fault you for that. If I had waited, they'd still be alive.
David cried.
It's not your fault, David. It's not your fault.
Midnight cooed, hugging him even tighter.
Don't you lie to me. Not you. Anyone but you should hate me. Everyone should. I killed them. It's not your fault. It's not your fault.
Midnight said, bringing her head back to look at David.
How can you say that? I'm a murderer. You should hate me.
David managed to say between sobs.
I can't hate you, David.
Midnight whispered.
Why? How could you not? You were trying to save them. But
David started.
I don't care. All that matters to me is who you are now.
Midnight said firmly.
How?
David whispered.
Because I love you.
Midnight admitted, her voice nearly a whisper.
What?
David asked, turning his head to look into Midnight's beautiful sapphire eyes.
I love you,
she repeated, no trace of fear or waver in her voice. David didn't move for a moment. Try as he might, he couldn't think or speak. Midnight's words bounced around in his head over and over again until he was sure he understood her. He slowly turned in Midnight's embrace, until he was squarely face to face with her, Without another moment of hesitation, he wrapped his arms around her and pulled her as close as he could. His tears broke free again, in full force, and he buried his face in Midnight's fur. Midnight gladly held him as close as she could, her own tears spilling free as she held him.
I'm so sorry.
David barely managed to say through the tears.
It's okay. It's all okay now. I love you.
Midnight cooed.
I love you too. I love you so much,
David said, his voice hoarse and weak. It was a long time before either David or Midnight could pull away from each other. But alas, eventually David had to. The cold had finally registered with him, and he was shaking. Midnight took immediate notice of his shivering and immediately pulled him back into her embrace.
Come on, big guy. Let's get you home,
Midnight whispered into his ear. David managed a shaky nod and squeezed Midnight closer one more time before they fully separated. Midnight was quick to turn and lead the way back up the mountain with David close behind her. They made their way slowly, the physical and emotional drain of the day weighing heavily on them as they climbed. Soon enough, they were at the top of the cliff and following the trench back to the road.
Hey, Mid?
David asked while he rubbed his hands together for warmth.
Yeah?
Midnight answered, turning her head to acknowledge him.
Just... Thank you. For everything.
Midnight stopped and turned around fully to face David. She made her way over to him, before rearing back on her hind legs and placing her forelegs on his shoulders. She leaned forward and kissed him.
I'd do it all again in a heartbeat,
she said, after pulling away. David smiled at her words and hugged Midnight close again. Once she dropped back to her hooves, they resumed the journey back to her house. David and Midnight made the short trek back in silence. Neither one had the energy to start up a conversation, so they merely focused on getting back to the house as quickly as possible to get David out of the cold. After a few minutes, the sight of Midnight's house greeted them both with open arms, and they made their way to the front door. Midnight unlocked the door and pushed it open with her magic. She ushered David inside and quickly closed the door behind them.
All right. How about you go ahead and take a seat on the couch? I'll get us some hot chocolate and start a fire so you can warm up, big guy,
Midnight said with a sincere smile.
I can help,
David said through a shiver.
David, please. Let me take care of you.
David looked like he was about to speak, but thought better of it. He slowly closed his eyes and nodded his head, before going and sitting down on the couch. Within moments, a blanket was levitated onto his back, and wood moved into the fireplace. Midnight cast a quick spell, and a pleasant fire began to burn in the fireplace. She quickly moved back to the kitchen and removed 2 mugs from the cabinet. Within minutes, she was back with 2 mugs of hot chocolate in her magical grasp. She added marshmallows to both as usual, with a little extra in one of the mugs. She hopped onto the couch and found her spot laying down on David's lap. After a moment of deliberation, she levitated the mug with extra marshmallows to David and brought the other one to her lips. I think you gave me yours, David said as he eyed the extra marshmallows in his mug.
Nope,
Midnight responded before taking another sip.
but you love marshmallows. You always add extra to yours,
David said, his brow furrowing slightly.
I do,
Midnight replied with a smile. David sat there for a moment, looking into his mug, then back at hers, before he set his mug down onto the table next to the couch. He turned back to Midnight and pulled her close again. His eyes watered as he held her, and his entire body trembled. The stabbing pain in his heart from before was replaced with a new pain. A loving pain that warmed his heart and soul. It pushed out every other sense and feeling he had. He felt nothing but that beautiful pain in his chest as he held her closer, and nothing else in the world seemed to matter to him. The only thing that truly mattered was that beautiful graphite mare he held in his arms for what could have been forever.
What did I do to deserve you?
David asked, his voice coming out choked and weak.
You didn't have to do anything. You're the light to my dark,
Midnight answered, feeling her voice waver too. Midnight nuzzled David's cheek affectionately, as the tears began to flow freely again. The day's events replayed in her mind, and she couldn't help but allow her own tears to fall as well. She had never seen David so vulnerable before, and the only thing she wanted to do was hold him close and tell him that everything would be alright. So she did. She held him until they both had no tears left to shed. Eventually, the fatigue of the day's events finally caught up with them. David was the first to feel sleep tugging at his being. He slowly lay down onto the couch, with midnight coming to a rest on his chest. The warmth of the fire and the soothing melody of her beating heart soon lulled him to sleep, and David's soft breaths warmed Midnight's heart. For quite some time, she only held on to him as he slept, desperately hoping to stave off any nightmares that would ruin his rest after such a painful day. Midnight rested her head against his neck, her ear picking up on every breath as it left his body. A smile forced its way onto her lips as she thought over everything. David was by no means a perfect stallion, but he was her stallion. After an hour or so, Midnight felt sleep calling for her as well, and her eyelids grew heavy. She nestled her head into the crook of David's neck and closed her tired eyes. She felt the calm embrace of sleep caress her mind, and within a few minutes, she was soundly asleep. Midnight awoke to the sound of knocking on her door. She wearily opened her eyes and looked out the window to find a dark world outside. After a moment of contemplation, she realized it was nighttime.
Oh, shit.
Midnight whispered to herself, careful to not wake David. She gingerly hopped off the couch and quickly made her way to the door. She easily saw all four of the princesses through the window and hastily opened the door. An entourage of royal guards was dispersed throughout her front yard, and the four princesses regarded her with mixed looks of worry and confusion.
Oh, Midnight, thank goodness you answered,
Celestia said, sounding heavily relieved.
We've been looking for you and David all day. Are you two all right? We heard about how he ran away. You found him, right?
Luna asked, still sounding concerned.
David's all right, princesses. Thank you for the concern. I'm really sorry I didn't get back to you, but after the day David had, I just thought it best to bring him back here and rest.
Midnight explained, stifling a yawn.
Is he okay?
Cadence asked.
He's fine. It was just an emotionally draining day for both of us. If Dr. Winnie was right about his headaches, then I think he shouldn't have any more.
Midnight explained.
So you got him to open up about it?
Twilight asked with a curious expression.
Yeah, it was, pretty tough on him.
Midnight admitted sadly.
I see. Well, we just wanted to be sure that you two were all right. When we went back into the room to find you both missing, I feared something had gone horribly wrong. I'm just so relieved to see that both you and David are well.
Celestia said with a sincere smile.
Thank you, all of you, but I won't ask you to leave. In fact, you can stay with us if you want. But it's been a very long day, and if it's at all possible, I'd like to get back to David.
Midnight said as politely as she could. Celestia stifled a chuckle before answering.
Thank you, Midnight. While we appreciate the offer, I think you two deserve some time alone. If you ever need anything, don't hesitate to come back to the castle and ask. We'll always be there for our friends. Have a happy heartswarming.
Celestia replied with a quick bow of her head. The other three princesses followed with their own bows and farewells, before turning to leave.
Thank you, every pony. I owe you all everything. Thank you so much.
Midnight said with a soft smile. Celestia turned and gave a quiet nod before turning back and walking away with the rest of her entourage in tow. Midnight quietly closed the door and made her way over to David to find him still soundly asleep. She gently climbed back into her spot on his chest and laid down with him. After taking a moment to find the most comfortable position, she softly sighed and nuzzled her head against his cheek. Within minutes, she was soundly asleep, and the soft sound of their steady breaths filled the air once more. Things right now are better, that's for sure, but I have a feeling it's not over yet. Can't be that easy. Anywho, let's get on to our problem solvers of donators. Top donators: Jessie Smith, Zar630, BadassWaffle, Only One Thing, Ceru, Orion, and IronSky. Match for 9, JockeTF, Toxide Raiden, Narwhals, Black Moonar, Pastel Skies, Austin Rollins, Stu, Hex, Star Brother, Mordred, Armica, Lyra, Ruin, 952, Will, Chris, Twinkie, Rysel, Shadowman, Luigi, 88, Chance, Request, Pick, Smoke 369, Bobcat, GGF, Murder Princess, and many more amazing people. Thank you all so much for watching this video and live life to the fullest.